Welcome to our Digital InfoDay session. This webinar will explain new up-and-coming treatments and future directions of myeloma research. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on our website and on Facebook afterwards. If during the webinar you'd like to chat to each other, you can use the chat box, and if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A box. Both of these can be found at the bottom of the screen. My name is Alice and I'm the Patient Information Manager at Myeloma UK. Now, some of you may not be that familiar with Myeloma UK, so I'd like to tell you briefly who we are and what we do. So Myeloma UK exists to support all those affected by myeloma and its related conditions, which include smoldering myeloma, MGUS and AL amyloidosis. We are patient-focused and we aim to empower, inform and support patients in everything that we do. As an organisation, we rely on the generosity and kindness of supporters fundraising and donating. Myeloma UK receives no core government funding, so your support is vital and we are truly thankful for all contributions as they allow us to continue working to help patients, their families and friends. So this evening, I'd like to welcome our expert, Dr. Rakesh Popat. Dr. Rakesh Popat is a consultant haematologist and honorary associate professor at University College London Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust. So thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, Dr. Popat. I'll now hand over to you to start our presentation.
Thank you very much, Alice, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's taken time out this evening to join us for this next 1 hour. The plan for this presentation is to cover a number of different aspects about research. We're going to talk about some of the new treatment approaches and how drug approvals can happen. I'm going to touch on and have an overview of the latest research that's happening across the UK and indeed further across the field. And then at the end, we're going to have a few pointers as to how patients and yourselves can actually participate and be involved in the research. And throughout the session, there will be a couple of points where we'll stop and pause, and I'll have a bit of a discussion with Alice and hopefully answer some of your questions. So let's start off with a little bit about drug development. Some of you may be familiar with this pathway, but some of you may not. And this really explains as to how things occur, why it takes such a long time for a new drug to come through, and why drugs can potentially be so expensive. The pathway is quite a difficult one, from drug discovery all the way to licensing and to be delivered within the NHS and to be given routinely in clinical practice. The first point is the preclinical work, which is incredibly important and is normally performed either in academic laboratories, such as hospitals or universities across the world, or in pharmaceutical laboratories. This is quite a labour-intensive and expensive screening process, looking for small molecules, and a number of different targets and lead molecules are identified at this stage. But lots and lots of these molecules will drop out at a very early stage. At that preclinical stage, a small number of lead candidates are identified and move forward into clinical trials. And the clinical trials take form in a number of different phases. We start off with phase 1, which is often first in human, and that's really the first time that we're testing a new drug for people with multiple myeloma. That is really designed at looking at the safety and how well tolerated the drug is. That's really what it's all about. It's just seeing if this is a safe drug and what would be the correct dose and what would be the correct schedule to give this drug to. Now, if that phase 1 study is positive, then it then moves into the subsequent phases. The phase 2 is checking to make sure that the safety signal is okay and to have an idea as to whether this drug is actually effective in myeloma. And then we move into the big phase 3 trials, where typically the new drug is compared to a standard drug to see if the new drug is superior to the standard drug. And on that basis, a drug is typically licensed. Normally, drugs are licensed in the US and then swiftly followed by the EU. And then once drugs are licensed within the EU, they undergo a health technology assessment. And that's essentially how drugs are evaluated for use within the NHS by the body known as NICE. NICE will give their answers as to whether or not they think the drug is effective and indeed is cost effective, which is a very topical area at the moment. And then we'll give recommendations for these drugs and agents to be adopted into the clinic. Now, that isn't the be-all and end-all, because actually at that stage, the hospitals then have to work out how exactly they're going to deliver the drugs which have been recommended by NICE. And then we try and bring back a feedback loop. So after we're using it in clinic, the idea is to gain additional information from people who are receiving this treatment, gather feedback, send it back to the companies, and then try and do some of that fine-tuning to make these drugs better and use them in the correct way. So this is the pathway, and typically it can take around 12 years for a drug to go through this process, and it costs a large amount of money. Now, there's been some recognition that this process is probably taking too long, and so there's now an accelerated pathway in place. And we've been participating in a drug which is one of the first to be approved in the accelerated pathway for myeloma, which is known as belantamab mafodotin. But even this in the accelerated pathway has taken 5 years from the first time we dosed the very first patient in the world, which we did at UCLH, to the license which came through this year. So that was 5 years on an accelerated pathway. And the licensing happened after phase 2, and we're now moving forward into phase 3 and other drugs. So it still takes a bit of time for drug development to occur. So I've touched on this before. The health technology assessment is essentially how drugs are approved within the National Health Service, and they look at the clinical effectiveness and also the cost effectiveness of the treatment. And an important factor is that they compare it to what we would consider to be the standard within the UK, which is not necessarily what the standard would be in the world. And this often leads to some complications and difficulties in the health technology assessments. And you may have heard that a number of these drugs get bounced initially. And one of the reasons why that occurs is because there's a bit of the clarity isn't really there as to how some of the new drugs perform compared to what the UK standard is, as opposed to the global standard, which is what the clinical trials are based around. So this is how drug approval occurs within the UK. We do have devolved nations, and so the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence really makes recommendations for drug use within England and Wales. Scotland has a slightly different process, which is run by the SMC, and they will give their views. And every now and again, you get a bit of disparity between England, Wales, and Scotland, which is never a good thing for the United Kingdom. And then Northern Ireland does follow typically the NICE guidance. And actually, the NICE guidance is very well reputed, and a number of different countries in Europe do follow NICE. So a number of treatments are available for multiple myeloma, and these are always changing. You'll all be no doubt hearing about COVID-19 almost every day on the news, and you'll be experiencing this in your life. But COVID-19 has changed things across the panel in drug development. Routinely, the drugs that we're using for myeloma have moved somewhat. We're using a lot more oral-based treatments, and this is to try and protect people and try and keep them home as much as possible. There's thankfully been some easing of some of the current restrictions around treatment, which we're welcoming. We're not sure how long this is going to take place for. We think it's going to be in place until early next year, certainly, and we'll wait and see how long it can occur for. So my talk's mainly about new drugs, but I'm just going to very briefly touch on the standard treatments. For newly diagnosed patients who might be eligible for a stem cell transplant, the typical treatment will be with Velcade, dexamethasone, and thalidomide. Sometimes we use cyclophosphamide instead. And that would be as induction, so to speak, to a stem cell transplant. For those of you that may not be fit enough to be having a stem cell transplant, we would typically use Revlimid and dexamethasone as a first-line treatment. You could use bortezomib, and there is an option to use low-dose melphalan as well. But typically, it's Revlimid and dexamethasone. Scotland is able to give maintenance treatment following the stem cell transplant, and in England and Wales, we're still arguing out with NICE to try and get it over the line. For second-line treatment, we've got a large number of treatments, as you can see, and this is helped by the interim Cancer Drugs Fund due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But you can see there's a wide variety of different agents. I won't read them all out to you, which can potentially be used for use when you relapse for the first time. This is second line. And in italics, you can see some of the treatments which are now available due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On the screen now, you can see the drugs available at third and fourth line. Again, a large number of treatments which are available. You will realize, however, that many of these names are repeated. So you can't typically use treatments more than once. Every now and again, you may be able to. So moving onwards, there's a number of treatments that you can see are available, and they do tend to hop around between the different lines. So we need to try and work out what is the correct treatment at each time point. So there's a number of treatments which are currently being appraised by NICE. You can see that for newly diagnosed patients who might be suitable for a stem cell transplant, NICE are currently looking at the addition of the monoclonal antibody daratumumab in conjunction with the standard treatment, which is bortezomib, thalidomide, and dexamethasone. And there's some very nice clinical trial data showing that if you add daratumumab to VTD, you get very nice high response rates. We're also, as I mentioned, looking at Revlimid maintenance following the stem cell transplant. Carfilzomib, Revlimid, and dexamethasone has a preliminary no. And in the future, NICE will soon be looking into some really interesting novel treatments. The first is selinexor in combination with bortezomib and dexamethasone. I'll talk about selinexor in a moment. And also one of the new treatments, CAR T cells, which is ide-cel for short. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And Scotland will be looking at isatuximab and pomalidomide, which is a treatment that is already available in England and Wales. And so the research is looking at brand new drugs, and we're also looking at approved drugs, looking at different combinations or using these drugs in different fashions for myeloma. So that's really what the research is about. So let's focus on some of the new drugs. I mentioned selinexor. Selinexor is a new class of drug. It's known as a SINE compound and essentially prevents molecules from moving from one part of the myeloma cell to another. It seems to be quite an effective drug, particularly for those of you who have failed all the standard treatments for myeloma. It's had some mixed press, mainly because of the side effect profile can be a little bit difficult to manage. Typically, nausea and weight loss are the major problems. But what we're seeing with selinexor is that once you start combining it with other treatments, particularly bortezomib or daratumumab, then you can reduce the dose of selinexor and it becomes more tolerable. And so that's probably where we'll start to use selinexor in the future. The next one on the screen is venetoclax. Venetoclax is a very interesting drug and is probably the first of a new class of drug which targets a specific genetic abnormality within myeloma. So this is a type of precision medicine where essentially we look at the type of myeloma that someone has and says, right, this drug will work very well for this type of myeloma. And venetoclax works particularly well for those people who have a genetic marker known as T1114 or the 1114 translocation. And that affects something like 15 to 20% of people with newly diagnosed myeloma. I'm going to talk about the antibody drug conjugate belantamab shortly, as well as melphalan. And we'll also talk about the mechanisms of CAR T cells, T-cell engagers, and virotherapy. So let's start with antibody drug conjugates. This is a new class of treatment for multiple myeloma, and belantamab mafodotin is the first of these drugs to be licensed in Europe for patients with relapsed myeloma who've failed at least 3 previous treatments. This is how this drug works. It targets a protein on the cell surface known as BCMA. BCMA is a new target on myeloma cells and is a very specific target for myeloma cells. Essentially what happens is this antibody latches onto BCMA and it invokes the immune system to kill the myeloma cells, rather like other antibodies such as daratumumab does. But the difference here is that this antibody is linked to a very powerful chemotherapy drug. And the myeloma cell in picture number 2, you can see absorbs this drug inside the myeloma cell here. And in picture number 4, you can see it releases that chemical and kills the myeloma cell from within. So it's a way of delivering a highly effective drug in a targeted fashion. I kind of talk about it like delivering a missile to the myeloma cell. You fire at the myeloma cell and it explodes from within. So belantamab, as I said, is now licensed and is not yet NICE approved. We're not sure when NICE will be looking at this. And there's a number of other antibody drug conjugates being investigated at the moment. This is melflufen. It's a take on an old drug known as melflan. Some of you may be familiar with melflan because it's used as part of the stem cell transplant and is one of our older chemotherapy drugs. What they've done here is that they've packaged up this chemotherapy drug very nicely into a packet. What that means is that it causes less side effects. And some of you who went through a transplant will be familiar with the sore mouth and the diarrhea that happens. So this packaging of the melflan prevents some of that from happening. And so this package gets absorbed within the myeloma cell. And then once it's within the myeloma cell, it gets broken down, and this powerful chemotherapy drug gets released and damages the DNA of the myeloma cells and causes it to die. So as I said, we're trying to work out where melflufen is going to sit at the moment, and there's a number of different investigations going on. A lot of you may have heard about CAR T cells. These are agents which are approved for leukemia and lymphoma, which are other types of cancers, but are being investigated now for myeloma. In this process, we remove white blood cells from a patient with myeloma, similar to the process with the stem cell mobilization. These white cells, which are known as T cells, go off to a manufacturing site where they are infected with a virus, which causes these to be genetically modified. Essentially, what this means is that these are targeted to kill the myeloma cells, because one of the problems with the immune system in myeloma is that they are not targeting the myeloma cells. They've fallen asleep and they're not actively killing myeloma cells. So this manufacturing process activates these T cells, they redirect it to a target on the myeloma cell, and then we expand them, we grow them up. They're frozen and then they're shipped back to the hospital, and then the myeloma person comes into the hospital. We give some gentle chemotherapy whilst you're in hospital, and then deliver the CAR T cells. You then need to stay in hospital for approximately 2 weeks, where these T cells become very activated and can start to kill the myeloma cell. And then once they start to calm down, we can release you back out and then follow you up thereafter. And the hope is that these living T cells will then roam around the body and will be killing the myeloma cell and will be keeping them under control. The next class is something called a T cell engagers, and this is a very similar process to the CAR T cells. These are little fragments of antibodies which lock onto the surface of a myeloma cell, shown here, with one arm, and with the other arm, they grab onto your T cell, the T cell being the immune cell. So they're kind of doing the same job as a CAR T cell. What they're doing is that they're dragging your immune cells up front, close to the myeloma cell, and causing and forcing that T cell to kill the myeloma cell. The side effect profile is quite similar. You get a very activated immune system, and so you need to be in hospital initially when we're delivering these drugs to look after the side effects which can occur. But the advantage of this is that we don't need to send cells off for manufacturing. The manufacturing process takes about 6 weeks. And so these are off-the-shelf drugs which can just deliver to someone and start acting straight away. And these are going through clinical trials. They're very interesting. And then briefly, virotherapy. This is a very early type of treatment where we deliver viruses, which is typically a measles virus or a mumps virus, to someone, and this virus infects the myeloma cells and causes the myeloma cells to die. And when the myeloma cells die, it releases the virus, which can then kill other surrounding myeloma cells. And it also activates your immune system to kill myeloma cells too. In terms of side effects, well, you feel a bit of a gentle fever and can feel a bit achy like you do with a viral infection, but otherwise it doesn't seem to be too bad. So that was a brief overview in the first 20 minutes. And at that point, I'd like to stop and we could maybe discuss some of these in a bit more detail. So over to you, Alice.
Yes, thank you so much for that overview. I'm sure many people will find that very interesting. I've got some questions here, and thank you so much for everyone who submitted them. And don't forget, you can keep submitting them using the Q&A box. But first of all, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Popat, do any of the new treatments in the pipeline replace stem cell transplant, do you think?
So that's a fantastic question. We've been trying to replace stem cell transplantation for quite some time. It's quite a toxic process, as those of you who've been through it will be aware. What we're trying to do at the moment is a couple of things. The first thing is that, is there a group of people who do not necessarily need stem cell transplant. And those would be people who have no bad risk features, such as bad risk genetic features. And for those, we think that we might be able to carry on just delivering the same treatment on and on and on without doing the stem cell transplant. The data on that is a bit sketchy. Most of the trials actually show that stem cell transplantation is the correct thing to do, but we're still investigating it as our treatments get better and better. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to talk about the pipeline treatments, which you asked about, Alice. So yes, we are going to be investigating whether or not we can replace stem cell transplantation with CAR T cells and with T cell engagers, because this is the way of invoking the immune system to kill and get rid of myeloma cells. Those trials will be opening in the future. We're not quite ready to open them just yet. We're still focusing on patients with relapsed myeloma, but I've seen the new trials which are coming through, and will be addressing newly diagnosed people and trying to replace stem cell transplant. So watch this space.
That's great. That kind of leads us on to the next question about what you expect frontline treatment to be in, say, 5 years' time.
Yeah, so that's going to be really interesting. The way we're moving at the moment is to be using 4 drug combinations. And I told you that NICE will be appraising daratumumab with Velcade, thalidomide, and dexamethasone. Now, daratumumab is one of many antibodies. There's going to be other antibodies we'll be looking at. And the antibody drug conjugate belantamab is also being investigated as a 4-drug combination in clinical trials for newly diagnosed patients. So I think the first step will be using 4 drugs for newly diagnosed patients. Those are for the fitter patients. For those maybe older and frailer patients, then hopefully by using more effective drugs, but less intensive, we can still be making good progress in trying to control the myeloma. What I'm wondering, though, is whether or not we can deliver some of these immunotherapies very early on, because I think that these immunotherapies can make a major difference to the way myeloma is managed. And if we deliver these immunotherapies right up front, then we might get some fantastic results. And just finally, just very briefly, we are moving to an area of targeted therapy. I mentioned venetoclax as being a genetically targeted treatment. What we hope to do in the future is to identify the genetic abnormalities and to give you a drug which will help that specific genetic abnormality.
And are there any drugs at the moment other than venetoclax that are targeted?
Yes, so some of you may be aware that myeloma genetically is quite a difficult disease to treat. It's not like lung cancer, bowel cancer, where there's what we would call a driver mutation, where you can pick a drug which will hit the main cause of myeloma. Myeloma doesn't work like that. We don't have driver mutation, so you can't just pick a drug off the shelf and kill myeloma cells. Having said that, there are a number of mutations in a gene called RAS, and there are drugs that target that pathway which are being used for solid tumors. So one of the things that are being investigated globally are pathway inhibitors of that, which are MEK inhibitors and BRAF inhibitors, which are used in solid cancers. And it may be that you can start using that for subgroups of people with myeloma.
And how soon do you expect some of these drugs to be available for use, every day in clinic?
Yeah, so that's a question which I think a lot of us struggle with. Hopefully, with these accelerated pathways, things are moving forward fairly swiftly. In terms of CAR T cells, we are hoping that the lead product for CAR T cells, ide-cel, will be licensed early next year. On the accelerated pathway. If it doesn't make it on the accelerated pathway, then it might be licensed towards the end of next year or maybe early the year after that. In which case, we would hope that NICE approvals would follow swiftly after. So best case scenario, CAR T cells will come to routine NHS care towards the end of next year. In terms of the T cell engagers, they're further back. And so I think it's going to be a bit longer. Selinexor is not licensed in Europe, it's licensed in the US. And we're hoping that might come through next year.
Well, it's very exciting to hear that there might be changes next year, towards the end of the year for sure. Which of these drugs would you say are the biggest game changer? Do you think is it CAR T and T cell engagers?
Yeah, so My personal view is that the only way that we are going to make a big, and I mean a very big difference in myeloma, is by invoking the immune system. What we've learned with all the drugs that we've been using up to until now is that they're quite effective in controlling myeloma. And if you continually give these drugs, you can get long-term remissions. But what we do know is that the myeloma comes back. And ultimately, what we want to do is to start curing people from myeloma. And I think the only way that we're going to do that is by activating the immune system, because what we're going to need is constant surveillance of the immune system. And the only way to do that is by these immune therapies, whether it be CAR T cells or T cell engagers, I don't know. Certainly the CAR T cells at the moment aren't producing the results that we would have hoped. Now, the future research is all about augmenting it, adding whistles and bells onto the CAR T cells, making them better. And it may be that we will get longer durabilities of responses with CAR T cells. So I'm hopeful.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think a cure is possible?
If you look at the literature, then you could argue that some patients are already being cured. And that's because we all have a small proportion of people with myeloma who have survived 20 plus years. And at some point, you've got to wonder when you'll die from something else as opposed to myeloma. So I think to some extent that already exists. And what that starts to tell you is that there is a possibility of having long-term disease control. Now, we may not be able to cure myeloma in the majority, but what we might be able to do is to keep it in a very low phase, or what we call an indolent or maybe even a precancerous sort of phase for a long period of time, being controlled with some of these treatments. And that's what I'd hope we might start to see. And then just to come back to maybe your question about how might myeloma treatments be different in the future, Alice. Well, I think what we will start to do is we'll be starting to treat people with myeloma earlier. I think we're treating myeloma a bit too late at the moment. Diagnoses are happening too late. If we can intervene before the myeloma gets too resistant, then we stand a much better chance at curing myeloma. And that's really where the future is going to go, is intervening potentially with the high-risk smoldering cases before it gets into myeloma and causes the bone problems, the kidney problems, and so forth.
Okay, and just to go back to the accelerated pathway, would you mind just explaining a bit more about how that works and how it's different from the normal pathway?
Yeah, so the accelerated pathway was brought in by the regulators a number of years ago, mainly because clinicians and patients, lobby groups were saying that it's just simply taking too long for drug approvals to occur. Because if you think about a phase 3 trial is quite a big study. You're typically recruiting something like 300 patients globally. And the main factor that you'll be looking at is the time at which the myeloma comes back. Now, when we know that over 50% of patients with myeloma are living 10 years, the question is, when you run a new trial for myeloma, how long do you have to wait until you get the results? Because it could be 5-6 years before people relapse and you get a readout. And that's just not acceptable for patients to be waiting that long for a readout before you can access a drug. So this is where accelerated approvals have come through. To say, okay, this drug is good because people relapse later with one drug compared to another drug, is to take a different view on it and say, okay, why don't we take a bit more of the risk? And we'll go to a phase 2 trial, which is a much smaller trial, maybe 50, maybe 100 patients globally recruited, and just simply look at the response. And if we think that this drug fulfills an unmet need, then this drug will be approved. So an example is belantamab mafodotin. This drug was approved on a phase 2 trial, which was 190 patients globally, and was approved on the basis that people who'd failed bortezomib, Revlimid, pomalidomide, and daratumumab had a response rate of about 30%. And that was better than any of the standard treatments that we had. Now, what that does mean is that the approval is conditional and can be revoked if the later phase trials do not continue to demonstrate a benefit.
And then, so what then happens to patients who've been on that drug and then the licensing is revoked?
Well, that hasn't happened yet, so I'd be interested to see what happens. But essentially, what one would envisage is that if you're deriving a benefit from a drug, you would not stop that. So you would continue it. But if there was evidence that actually this drug wasn't working, then the recommendation would be to come off.
Right. So another question on a similar line. Why is it that some treatments have been approved for use in certain parts of the country and not in others?
Yeah, so I mean, a good example of this is Revlimid maintenance, I think, which is currently approved for use in Scotland, but not in England and Wales. It's because we are in a devolved nations, and health responsibilities for healthcare and budgets are undertaken by the different governments, and so there are different processes. It does, to me, seem a bit difficult that you can have maintenance treatment if you cross the border and live in Edinburgh, but you can't in London. And I would hope that it would be approved in the UK. So it's simply because of the devolved nations, unfortunately. But the processes should be very similar. That should be followed.
Thank you. So just having a look, and thank you to everyone who is sending in their questions. So someone here is asking whether using more powerful drugs means that you're actually seeing the periods between relapses increasing. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. So if we go back historically, and if you look at how people with myeloma might have done maybe 10 years ago, then typically what you see is that when the myeloma comes back, the myeloma is more resistant and the durations of response get shorter and shorter as time goes on. Now, with these new drugs, we are seeing the tables turned on this. And certainly I've got a number of cases where patients at 7th or 8th line have had longer durations of response to one of these new drugs than they did to their first stem cell transplant, for example. And that's purely because we're using much more effective drugs that work in a different way. So it is interesting what's happening at the moment. We are seeing much better and more durable responses with these better drugs. And that's really why we've got to move these up further up the line, because there's no point waiting till you get to 4th or 5th line to get a really good drug. You want to start getting it as early as possible so that you can really enjoy that time when your myeloma is in remission. One thing just to point out is that most of these drugs are given continuously without break. So you are on ongoing treatment. The only exception so far is CAR T cells, where you get a break.
And do you think that's the future of treatment, just to carry on and not have treatment breaks?
Well, you know what, I think we're probably doing a full circle on this. So certainly up until now, the belief is that we should be given continuous treatment for as long as possible to suppress myeloma. The problem that we're facing is twofold. The first is that all of these drugs have side effects. And I'm sure many of you who are listening to this would love not to be on treatment and to be enjoying your life in remission without any drugs. That would be what we'd all want to aspire to. The second problem is that if you give a drug continuously for a number of years, then the cost goes up. And as the cost goes up, it becomes more difficult for drugs to be approved through the NHS, and which limits really what we're trying to achieve here, because we're trying to maximize lifespan. So a lot of us now are looking to see whether or not we can curtail treatments, and we're looking at new techniques such as minimal residual disease and whole body scanning to try and have a much better and closer idea of how the myeloma is responding, and try and understand if we can stop the treatments and then keep an eye on people very closely using these very sensitive techniques and detect very low levels of myeloma and then restart treatment. So I'm hoping that we're not going to be always doing continuous therapy. It'd be nice to give everyone a break of treatment.
Yes, and I'm sure many people watching would agree with that. So I think we've got time for one more question in this section, and it's about whether people will be excluded from being able to have certain treatments. So if you are a patient and you're diagnosed quite late and there's a number of treatments that you're resistant to, does that mean that we're going to end up with a group of patients who aren't going to end up with effective treatments in the future?
So I'm not quite sure if I understood that correctly, Alice. But are you saying that if you've had multiple different treatments, do you not have any treatments available? Sorry, is that the...
Yes, I suppose so. Especially with the newer treatments coming in, because lots of them will be approved with certain restrictions. Does that mean that?
Okay. So I get that. So this is one of the this is probably the biggest bugbear that I have with the way NHS approvals are coming through. They are coming through in very restricted manners. So we've just seen in England and Wales isatuximab, which is a monoclonal antibody, approved with pomalidomide and dexamethasone for people who've had 3 previous treatments, so at 4th line, but no further on than 4th line. This is basically down to a negotiation between the drug company and NICE, and it's approved on the basis of that, purely on cost effectiveness. What that does mean, that you're quite right, is that those of you that may have gone past that aren't eligible to receive these treatments. And I've got a number of people who have missed daratumumab, which is a CD38 antibody, earlier on, and then are missing it later on down the line, and unfortunately aren't eligible for clinical trials, because all of our clinical trials expect patients to have had daratumumab. So it is quite difficult when people fall between the lines on these treatments, and you miss some of the drugs which were available earlier on. And certainly if you're thinking about some of these new drugs, they may be licensed earlier on in the treatment pathway, and it may be that you've missed them because you're further down. It's quite difficult to understand where to go with this. What I've been trying to do on a local level is trying to argue with the companies to try and get compassionate use access for these drugs, because that's really, I think, the just way of dealing with this imbalance, because I really don't think it's fair. Certainly, unfortunately, the Cancer Drugs Fund and the NHS won't fund these, so the real only way is to get a drug company to pay for them free of charge.
And could you just explain a tiny bit more about the compassionate use scheme?
Yeah, so some drugs are available through compassionate use schemes, and some need a bit of lobbying from your doctor. So currently, as far as I know, 2 drugs are available through the compassionate use scheme: belantamab mafodotin, which is the antibody drug conjugate, and selinexor. So these drugs are licensed in the world, but are not NHS approved. And until they are NHS approved, the drug companies are giving them free of charge to hospitals who are able to do that. Now, what I would point out is that these are drugs which aren't approved for England and Wales. So you need to always be a little bit careful about having them. But both of these drugs are licensed somewhere in the world, either in Europe or the US. So I think they're safe drugs to be given. The way to do that is to talk to your consultant to see whether you'd be eligible for them, and then your consultant applies directly to the drug manufacturer to get access to that. There are then some hoops that need to go through, because the hospital has to then agree to deliver one of those 2 drugs, because there's a cost implication associated with that. So that then has to be approved internally. I would always, however, recommend you to be enrolled into a clinical trial over a compassionate use drug. The reason why I say that is because the only reason that we're able to move forward with research and bringing all these brand new treatments is through participation in clinical trials. The next section, we're going to talk a little bit about how people can join into that. But if you're having access to a compassionate use drug rather than a clinical trial, it means that we've lost someone who we could have recruited into a clinical trial. So where I see compassionate use drugs being particularly helpful is if you don't qualify for a clinical trial, or if there's not a clinical trial available near you.
Great, thank you so much. That actually brings us nicely onto the next section. So thank you for answering those. And remember, if you've got any more questions, don't forget to pop them in the box. So I'll pass back to you, Rakesh. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was a great discussion, and we can discuss a few more points, I think, as we go on. The next section is fairly swift, and really is just to give you an idea about research in general. So there's a lot of other research happening globally. We're trying to understand who is more likely to develop multiple myeloma. So, for example, we know that patients who are from African origins are at a higher risk of developing multiple myeloma. And we're trying to also work out some of the genetic predispositions, because if you look at population-wide studies, there is a bit of clustering within families. So there appears to be some sort of genetic markers. So a lot of that work is currently trying to go ahead. And also trying to understand if there's any environmental precipitants. There was a bit of research, for example, suggesting that obesity was linked with the development of myeloma. So a lot of this work is still going on. We don't fully know why the myeloma occurs. We know that it is driven by genetic abnormalities that occur, but we don't know, for example, why some people have the precancerous condition MGUS and never go on to develop myeloma, whereas some people rapidly develop myeloma and some people have very aggressive types of myeloma. We don't fully understand why people do that. We also don't understand why people relapse all the time. We have an idea as to why drug resistance occurs, but we don't fully know that. And then finally, our technology is improving to try and measure myeloma better. And I've mentioned two of these techniques earlier. Whole body imaging, which can either be a whole body MRI scan or a PET CT scan. These are very sensitive techniques at looking at myeloma. And then minimal residual disease monitoring, which is when we perform a bone marrow biopsy and we send a sample for specialist analysis where we can detect one myeloma cell in 10,000 cells. So this looks at very low levels of myeloma that you would not normally detect by routine testing. We're trying to also look at risk factors for myeloma and prognostic factors. So what I'm talking about here is how can we help you understand your myeloma better when you're diagnosed? Many of these are genetic factors. So when you have your original bone marrow biopsy, we do some genetic testing on that, and we can advise you whether or not your myeloma might be what we'd call standard risk or might have more higher risk features. What a higher risk myeloma is that we would expect the myeloma to respond to treatment, but it might come back sooner than we would otherwise want it to come back. And if that's one of those cases, then you might be recommended to take part in a clinical trial where you can have a go at one of these new drugs. Prognostic factors also include various blood tests that we can do to see how aggressive the myeloma is. And also the scans are very helpful here, because if we see the myeloma is growing outside of the bone marrow, then that's normally a bad sign. Then in terms of measuring response to treatment, well, most of you will know that we follow the myeloma by measuring blood. We look at paraproteins, light chains in the blood, and urine analysis. But there are some new techniques coming through. There's something called mass spectroscopy, which is looking in much higher detail as to what's going on in the blood. We're looking at circulating myeloma cells. We're looking at DNA in the blood, and also different forms of imaging. So there's lots of different ways of measuring response. So we've talked a little bit about clinical trials already. I'm a strong advocate for clinical trials because I run a big clinical trials program, but it's a way of you to access a treatment that may not yet have been approved. And I've told you, even with the accelerated pathway, it still takes about 5 years from the first in human testing through to license. So you can get access to these drugs before they're approved. However, I must warn you that it's not straightforward to take part in a clinical trial. There are very strict criteria that you need to meet. And unfortunately, probably the most number of people who are referred to me don't actually get onto a clinical trial, either because you don't meet the criteria or the clinical trial isn't open at the time that you're being referred. So for you to take part in the clinical trial, not only do you have to fulfill the type criteria, but there has to be a clinical trial available for you at that time. So you've got to be quite lucky to get onto a study. If you do want to take part in a trial, and I would really recommend that, do speak to your local doctor. If you're in a big centre, they will probably be aware of clinical trials which are running. If you're in a smaller centre, then they can always phone a friend and speak to a doctor in a bigger centre, and you can get referred to a bigger centre when we can talk to you about the clinical trials. But please do take your own initiative about this. Myeloma UK does have a website. You can see that, the clinical trial finder on the screen, where you can do a search and try and understand what trials are running where. Sometimes it's a little bit out of date, which is part of the problem. And often people come to my clinic with a list of trials and I tell them that half of them are closed, which is always a little bit disappointing for them. But it's a start for you to move forward. So good example where you can join a platform and upload some data about yourself, and we can understand things. We're also doing some COVID research to try and understand how COVID affects you. So these are all ways that you can join and help us with research. And so these are the facilities that are available through Myeloma UK. There's a trial finder, there's a drug tracker, and there's various different information sheets available. So we'll stop there and take some more questions and a bit more of a discussion. So back to you, Alice.
Yes, thank you for that brief overview of trials. So following on from that, could you tell us what the status of clinical trials are at the moment? Because we know that the pandemic has obviously interrupted quite a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the first wave of COVID really delayed drug development, and pretty much every hospital across the country had to stop their clinical trials programs. Certainly, we at UCLH stopped recruiting during the first wave. Now we're back open and we're enrolling, and we fully plan on enrolling throughout this second phase of COVID. But not all hospitals have the capacity to be able to do that, because different hospitals have been hit by in different ways by COVID. So it's a bit of a mixed bag actually across the UK. Some hospitals are recruiting into trials, some aren't. But what has happened is that a lot of trials have been delayed, and the trials which should have opened 6 months ago haven't opened and are only opening now. So for those of you who are interested in clinical trials, we're probably going to open into a really nice area of clinical trials within the next month and going into next year, where there should be a lot of clinical trials available. But just bear in mind the capacity of the hospital, because COVID may limit that.
Do you think these delays will affect patients and their drug approvals later on?
Without doubt. Without doubt. We've already seen timelines for drug licensing move backwards because of delayed readouts for treatment. So unfortunately, it has pushed things back. And all we can do is just to get going with trials and try and recruit as well as we can.
So there's been a lot of focus on COVID, and there's been a lot of research going into that. Do you think the increased research will have beneficial implications for myeloma patients?
For COVID, do you mean? Yeah, no, absolutely. Because when we first had COVID, we didn't really understand what the risks were. Since that has happened, a lot of people have published data on how COVID affects patients with myeloma. And I think we understand things a lot better. I think one of the key features that I've learned with myeloma from the data sets is that one of the biggest risk factors for having severe COVID infection is by having active myeloma. So the best thing you can do is to have your myeloma under control. So certainly people with myeloma should get treatment and should continue to get optimal treatment, because if your myeloma is under control, then your immune system has a chance to recover, which is very important for COVID. So the other thing that we're trying to look at is to see whether people with myeloma can produce antibody responses to COVID, which becomes very important as a vaccine becomes available soon.
So I know that one of the treatments is dexamethasone, which a lot of myeloma patients are on. Do you mind just explaining a bit about that and then the effect it has?
Yeah, so dexamethasone is an interesting drug. Most of people with myeloma probably hate this drug because it causes havoc and keeps you awake at night. But dexamethasone is a very useful drug. We use it in very high doses in myeloma, typically 20 milligrams, sometimes 40 milligrams. And we use it at that sort of dose because it kills myeloma cells directly. But dexamethasone also has other effects, and it's an anti-inflammatory drug at lower doses. And for COVID, it's used at much lower doses than the myeloma dose. And for that purpose, it essentially dampens down the whole immune system. And that's one of the big problems with COVID, is that you get this secondary inflammatory response, and dexamethasone is very good at calming that down. I should also point out is that we can use dexamethasone for people who receive CAR T cells, because for CAR T cell therapy, you get a very exaggerated immune response. And it's a similar sort of thing happens. And if you have a severe immune response, then the way to dampen it all down is again with steroids, which calms the immune system down. So that's at lower doses where dexamethasone is being used, slightly different to the myeloma dose.
So a question's come in from Eleanor, so thank you for sending that in. And she's asking whether you have to have had remission and be starting a relapse to be considered for a clinical trial.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Most clinical trials stipulate that your myeloma must have relapsed. Because if you think about it, there's got to be a reason for you to go on to a study. If you're already on a treatment and it's working well for you, then there's no reason for you to switch treatments, essentially. So most studies will require you to have relapsed. A number of these new drugs, which we're working on certainly at the moment, on top of the fact that you have to have relapsed, you have to have relapsed whilst either receiving a drug or within 60 days of your last dose. So they're very specific. And some of them require you to have done that to all three classes of drugs: proteasome inhibitors, immunomodulatory agents, and CD38 antibodies. You don't necessarily have to have gone into remission, you just have to have lost your response to treatment.
So what does that mean for newly diagnosed patients? Are there no trials for
okay. So sorry, Sam, thank you for raising that. So what I was really referring to was the relapse studies, which is where these new drugs are coming through. We are running national trials for people with newly diagnosed myeloma. Those are asking different questions using more standard drugs. And so for that, you just have to have newly diagnosed myeloma and meet the criteria, and you can join.
Great, thank you for that clarification. So we would like to know, what do you think research should be focusing on in the future, and what are your priorities for research?
Good question. So for me, I think what we have to focus on is delivering a cure for myeloma. That is the end game. And so if that's what we want to achieve, then there's two major aspects that we need to move forward with. First of all, is that we need to understand more about why myeloma happens, because if we understand why myeloma happens, we can maybe try and prevent it from happening to begin with, or prevent the pre-cancer from turning into myeloma. So that's the first thing, is understanding the biology, and that will come from additional genetic work that is going on to try and really understand what's provoking this. The second aspect is by giving these good treatments. And the problem that we're still facing, even with all these new immune therapies, is that patients are relapsing. And we have to get over that, because there are a lot of people who are doing very well and living very well with myeloma. And many of you might be looking at the list of drugs that are available and be thinking, well, what happens when I get past that? And there's a lot of people with myeloma who are very well, who've gone through the standard treatments. And that's where we've really got to get these effective immunotherapies coming in. And that's, I think, where we need to focus a lot with the research, is getting the body's immune system to fight back against the myeloma to give that long-term control. I think it's incredibly difficult to eradicate a myeloma cell. The plasma cells which they came from are designed not to be killed. They're meant to be living in your body for a long time. So I think it's going to be incredibly hard to actually kill these myeloma cells. But what we need is the immune system to keep them in check. And that's what I want to focus on, is the immune development.
Thank you. You touched on MRD. Is there anything else up and coming about monitoring patients?
Yeah, so I've touched on a few of these kind of aspects. So with MRD, just to talk a little bit more about that, is that the way we're using MRD is being refined. The techniques are being improved, and so we should be able to detect myeloma at much lower and lower levels. So again, if you're aiming for a cure, you need to be able to work out how much myeloma you're eradicating. So that's where that comes into effect. I mentioned a technique called mass spectroscopy. Mass spectroscopy is very interesting because it's a very sensitive technique at looking at myeloma in the blood. So it kind of gets over this painful bone marrow process, which you have to do for MRD analysis. But we're doing a bit of work on that at the moment. Birmingham is actually leading that to try and tally that up. And I think that would be a really nice way of measuring myeloma. And in fact, it's a much more accurate way of measuring myeloma. And then finally, some of the work is looking at liquid biopsies. And essentially what that's looking at is taking a blood sample and looking at the cancer cells in the blood, minute amounts of cancer cells. That becomes important because one of the problems we have in myeloma is that the myeloma moves around the body. And you can treat someone with myeloma, and some bits of the myeloma gets better and some bits get worse. And what it turns out is that the genetic makeup of the myeloma in one part of the body is different from the genetic makeup of myeloma in the other part of the body. And we need to understand that because that will tell us what sort of drugs to use. So we need to understand that a little bit better. And these liquid biopsies, which pick up these circulating myeloma cells, will pave the way forward for that.
I'm sure many people would be happy if they didn't have to have any more bone marrow biopsies.
And just the last thing to say about imaging is that we're working on different types of PET scans to try and pick up different ways of bone damage. That's something to watch out for. We're running a trial, hopefully next year, with a different type of PET scan.
That's great to know. Thank you so much. So we've come to the end of our Q&A session. So I'd like to just cover and highlight some of our resources that Myeloma UK have. So Rakesh mentioned this before, but we do have our clinical trial finder and our drug tracker. As he said, they're a very good starting point if you want to find out more about the trials taking place and drugs in development. We also have a series of videos that you can watch, and these explain some of the topics that have been mentioned today. You can head along to the Myeloma UK website or go to our YouTube channel to find them. And we have a series of info sheets that are dedicated to new and up-and-coming drugs, and they can be downloaded from our website. So I'll pass back to Dr. Popat to sum up.
So thank you very much, Alice, and thank you very much for all of you who've been listening and asking the questions. So I just wanted to summarise with our 3 take-home messages for you. I think the future for myeloma is bright overall. I am optimistic. Myeloma research is moving at quite a rapid pace, and we are understanding why myeloma happens and how it moves forward. This is happening, and technology is helping us move forward. We've got some nice drugs and treatment strategies coming through, and this is all about giving better drug treatments to you, better, deeper responses, and trying to personalise the treatment approaches better. We know that one myeloma is not the same as another myeloma, and we need to personalise the treatments better. And please, please, please do take part in research. It can be whatever you want to take part in. There are a number of clinical trials, and I spend most of my time badgering people all over the world to bring new drugs to the UK. And it's vital that if we do have these drugs coming through, that we deliver our promise, which is to enroll patients onto clinical trials and to give you that opportunity to get some of these new treatments. So thank you very much, all of you, for listening, and back to you, Alice.
Thank you so much. Yes, we've come to the end of the webinar today. Thank you so much, Rakesh, for speaking and answering questions. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for the webinar. We hope you found it helpful and informative. If we didn't manage to answer your question, or this has maybe thrown up some new questions, please do get in touch with us. You can do this via our info line or our Ask the Nurse email service, the details of which are on our website. Keep an eye on our social media and website for announcements of further digital InfoDay sessions, and they'll be taking place next year, and the first one of those will be held in January. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.